All right, everybody. Welcome back to Chiro Shift, the podcast that will change your perspective of the chiropractic profession. I'm Dr. David Newton, and today I'm joined by co-host Dr. Taylor Goldberg and very special guest, Dr. Frank Benedetto. Could go on for a while talking about everything that Frank has done over the course of his career, but what intrigued me the most when I first met Frank was ultimately it wasn't the businesses that he's founded and built successfully, but rather his ambition to change healthcare for the better. It is something a lot of us talk about, a lot of us complain about, but ultimately Frank has taken massive action to do so. So Frank, welcome to the show. We're incredibly grateful to have you here with us.
Appreciate you having me here, David.
All right, so let's just jump right into it. We wanted to start today's podcast by really getting to the root of, what were your inspirations and motivations for wanting to change healthcare for the better? It's a crazy idea. We know there's all sorts of issues. Where did your motivations and inspirations come to start to go down this path?
Yeah, it starts in actually a pretty dark place, and there's a series of life-changing events where the medical system failed me and my family to varying levels, but the one no incomparable to the rest is the passing of my father from medical mistakes. He was a victim of the system through and through. And, it was very tragic. It was out of nowhere. He was 64. I was 26, 27. And he passed away from a heart attack in front of me and in the emergency room. And he was not being treated emergently because the medics that came to his house misdiagnosed him with dehydration. And 3 days before that, he went to urgent care type place and got prescribed a medication that no one with heart disease should ever have been prescribed. And 6 months before that, he had stents placed for the second time. And the surgeon told him that cardiac rehab's not really necessary. And despite my urging, he didn't go. And a decade before that, he was diagnosed with earlier stages of heart disease and diabetes, and no one gave a shit. And a decade before that, he tore his meniscus. He was facing away. I was not born yet. He was facing away from the ocean. Somebody on a boogie board came, popped him in the back of the knee, allegedly some sort of meniscus type injury. I believe he had surgery. And up until that point, he was a relatively in shape guy. He was never an exerciser, but he was an old school Italian dude. The nutrition was not good. But at that point, he didn't balloon up. He was a relatively healthy person. And it hit me in like the realm of what I could control as a doctor of physical therapy, at that moment, if he had actually went to someone in the rehab profession, chiropractor, physical therapist, personal trainer, nutritionist, someone who looked at him as a person, maybe the butterfly effect of that decades later could have ended this differently.
Thank you for sharing that story. And I know Taylor and I have both heard this before, and every time you tell it, it hits the same way. It's unfortunate that many of us have had family members or friends that have been failed by the current system. But we're so thankful for people like yourself and the people that you've worked with that we're beginning to create change for the better. So tell us a little bit about your journey, after these tragic events happened, and what was the aftermath of that? And then where did you really find yourself in a position where I can do something about this? I'm going to do something about this. And then to begin your journey to where you are today.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And what I'll say is that I spiraled out of control after that happened. I couldn't cope with it. I realized that I was, I spent the last few years of my life missing out on really the years with him that was lost to my career. And the way I was managing my career, the way this factory style mill was using me and preventing me from really doing the job that I really wanted to do, I couldn't handle it. And I ended up, long story short, there was a period of of alcohol abuse, and I spiraled in for many years until I finally woke up on my 30th birthday, realizing that I was the opposite of who I thought I would be on that big milestone. And that's when I decided to change. That's when I decided to take my own health in my hands, because at that point in time, I had absolute depression to the farthest level, anxiety, and these were not things that I had previously experienced prior to his passing. And I was significantly overweight. I had high blood pressure. I had low testosterone. I mean, I was only 30 years old, and I was really a train wreck physically. And my first attempt to get help was to a psychiatrist who put me on medications. And those medications were initially for ADHD. And then I had side effects from that made me more anxious. And I'm not an anxiety type person. Like, this was very atypical for me. But the side effects of that period of my life and then getting put on ADHD medication led to anxiety, which was new to me, and I didn't have the coping skills because this wasn't something that I experienced. Then that they gave me medication for the anxiety, and then I said, I'm thinking I'm depressed. Months later, and then they put me on depression medication. I'm aware that there are some people in the world who do need to go on medications. I am not rigidly anti-medication, but I do believe that 90% of people who are given it are not, one, really given it everything is every other option has been fully exhausted, or two, matched with behavioral interventions that should be go along with any time you do take a medication, so that you could be taking the most minimum viable dose. And luckily, I had a horrendous side effect to the depression medication that was eye opening. Like, whoa, what am I doing here? And I realized at that point that the medical system was not going to help me. And that's when I decided I am going to take my health in my hands, and I'm no longer trusting the system, but I am going to aggressively seek out different members of the medical community who I'm enlisting on my team, who I am going to use as a resource for me to make my decisions. And that's really when I started to turn things around. So I was able to wean off all of those medications 100% on my own. I learned things like mindfulness. I learned things like meditation, breathing techniques. I realized how my nutrition impacted everything else, my mental health, my physical health. And, one by one, I started to recruit different people from different professions and build my own medical team, is the way I started to look at it.
I love that. And I want to emphasize too that we're not saying medications are bad, but what you just talked about is a very holistic approach. And when we get into MSK care, so when we say MSK care, we're talking about physical therapists, chiropractors, anybody in that realm. That's usually why people get into this or seek out a physical therapist or a chiropractor, is because we have this envision of holistic care. But sometimes that holistic care ends up being just adjustments or just banded exercises or an exercise sheet. And it's not really about creating the life design that you want. I know you talk a lot about life design to clinicians. What would you say to patients or people looking to create a better life for themselves? What would be a good first step, and how can they start building this care team for themselves?
I think that if I was talking to a patient right now, I don't believe patients are being led to set goals or paint a clear picture of what they're aiming for. They have been trained by the medical community to just resolve symptoms. So if there was like a chart from like plus positive 10 to 0 to negative 10, let's just say you have an injury, that let's call that negative 3. The medical system just is designed to get you back to 0. Okay, you're not injured. Great. That's important. But what's plus 3 look like for you? What is plus 6? What is 10? And 10 doesn't have to mean like abs and whatever where stereotypical magazines have painted a picture of health. But what would your best version of your healthiest self look like in a very realistic way? And then breaking that down into more attainable goals. And I believe that people need to treat their bodies almost similar to like the way at the end of the day, I love business, and healthcare business is like what my life revolves around. So business is something I've given myself to study on. The business world operates in 90-day increments. And the reason why is that that is what we somehow as human beings were naturally oriented around. That's like what we could hold in our minds. That's what we could focus on. It's also the time period that we change our minds. So every 90 days in business, you get to have like a meeting with your team. You're like, what do we want to do different? Where do we want to go? I believe in treating your body like a business. And that sounds a little crazy, but the notion of it is you need your metrics. In business, you always need to understand your numbers. Most people, most consumers don't understand the numbers of their health. What is their HbA1c? What is their glucose levels, in the morning? What is their peak glucose levels throughout the day? How many hours of sleep? What's their REM percentage? We could build a scorecard of health, and knowing your own scorecard is potentially one of the most empowering things you could possibly do. And then let's say plus 10 is, I once had a mentor of mine many years ago. The guy he was like 50 and jacked. And I'm like, I was 35 and overweight and out of shape. I was like, Vinny, how do you do this? Like, what is this? And he leans into me and he's like, I believe that every human being should be able to run a mile. And he's like, and I believe that every human being should be able to do X amount of push-ups. And then he went off the wall a little bit. It was like, every human being should be able to squat 2.5 pounds times their body weight or some crazy shit like that. But the notion that he had a scorecard in his mind that was right for him, and that running a mile may or may not be the right scorecard for you if you're listening to this, but you should have a scorecard. And that scorecard should have like reasonable best healthy self, and then a very reasonable next step in that. So if you have suffered an injury and you haven't gone for a walk in 2 years, like, let's just make the goal go around the block. And maybe that's baby step 1 to 10. And maybe 10 is jogging a mile one day, or maybe 10 is just walking a mile one day. But getting more granular and in control of your own statistics, I think, is one of the most important things a consumer can do.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you talk about care on this individualized level, because I think so many people, when they're going to seek care for whatever their issues are, their injuries, their pain, whatever it is that they're dealing with, a lot of care seems to be very generic. All the back pain patients get the same thing. All the shoulder pain patients get the same thing. You're treated as a group of people, and it's never really individualized towards you as a person, as the patient, or towards you with maybe some of the goals that you just spoke about. We're not orienting care towards the individual's goals. So when you look at the professions like physical therapy and chiropractor, and a lot of the professionals and clinicians that you've worked with, what changes will you typically see, or what are some of the changes that you typically recommend for these clinicians to begin to start to build these different approaches? I know one of the things that you often talk about, and we'll give you an opportunity to speak about the Honey Badger Project here, is for clinicians to build mission-driven practices. What does that actually mean, and why is that beneficial, not just for the clinicians at the end of the day, but also for audience as the patients? What are they getting out of this when clinicians develop practices within this style?
So I'll start with a somewhat silly analogy. When's the last time you called a plumber to fix your electrical components of your house? You ever do that?
No.
No? Why not?
Doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. Okay. So the same thing can go in healthcare, where we live in this day and age where we do have access to digital health, fully remote health, which has allowed us to reach people as consumers. We could reach now clinicians who have dedicated their entire lives to one thing. And I don't know about you, but if we're being a little picky about who's working on our plumbing versus our electrical versus, a painter versus a carpenter, maybe we should start taking the same approach to our bodies and our health. And we know this in traditional medicine, like the bigger, I don't know what we would call like traditional medicine. We go to a cardiologist when we think there's something going on with our heart. We go to a pulmonologist when we think there's something going on with our lungs. But for some reason, when there's something wrong with our bodies, our more musculoskeletal system as a whole, we tend to see generalists. We think that like this whole system can be overseen by like a generalist in every capacity. And My belief is that there's really two ways to specialize. You could specialize in a type of person and solve all of their problems. So you might be able to go to a chiropractor or a physical therapist that has a whole body. They do treat the entire musculoskeletal system, but they specialize in athletes, new moms, people with hypermobility, post stroke, whatever it is that they've specialized in, but they treat the whole person, right? The the other way to specialize is by pathology. So there are people who are obsessed with one pathology, and let's just say sciatica. Like there are people that are like, man, I'm going to dedicate my career to sciatica. I'm going to dedicate my career to neck injuries. I'm going to dedicate my career to headaches. And sometimes we got to figure out like which one of those we need, but both are like readily available and accessible. And oftentimes they're even available to us locally. There's more and more local chiropractors that have either specialty programs or niches or have like adopted a unique way of practicing. But we tend to be very quick to just jump to whoever is the first on the Google search, whoever is the closest commute, and whoever, the one friend that recommended that other person. And sometimes that's not wrong, but I think to answer your question is like when a clinician specializes, you could rest assured that they're probably eating, breathing, and sleeping that specific thing. And I don't know about you, but that's who I want working on this meat vesicle that we get called the body, because we only get one. And if we're not just trusting anybody with our house, maybe we shouldn't just trust anybody with our bodies too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that maybe a lot of people are not aware of, is that there are chiropractors and physical therapists and other healthcare professionals that very much do specialize in these different aspects of the body, in these different pathologies. And I think that's one of the aims of this podcast, is really to bring awareness to that point, so that patients don't have to default to who's the person that's half a mile away from where I work or where I live, and really have the awareness that, okay, it's probably worth it to make that investment to begin to look for someone. And I know something that's becoming a much more common thing. I think this would be a great opportunity to discuss this, is that location doesn't even have to be a barrier anymore, and that people are working across virtual platforms and working through hybrid platforms. And I think this is something that's very new, and especially in the physical therapy and chiropractic space, is a very foreign topic for a lot of people, because how could you possibly perform a chiropractic treatment or a chiropractic visit or a physical therapy visit through a computer? This just doesn't make sense for a lot of people. So if that's something you could speak on a little bit, and how this could be beneficial, so that people understand that distance and location does not need to be a barrier for them when it comes to finding this specialist that can help them at the highest level.
Yeah, so the shortest way to explain this is that the professional who truly understands the human body can teach you how to take care of yourself. And there is a certain level of mastery to that some professionals have not yet attained or don't believe that is possible. Now, is it every single condition, every single diagnosis, every single person? No, there is always going to be a place for in-person care, and sometimes a necessity. However, 80% of cases, like the overwhelming majority, that is likely, if you're listening to this and you have some sort of just chronic pain, or you have a relatively classic presentation of an injury, that is most likely treatable and more effectively treated by yourself through the education and coaching of a clinician than having what is oftentimes transient, short-term lasting results from hands-on care that feels good, but doesn't always provide the actual true longer-term solution. I think that massage is a great example of this. Massage doesn't necessarily proclaim to make a permanent change in your body, but it feels good. And you could do it once a month. And if you really like getting, manipulations, aka back cracks for the audience here, is like there's nothing inherently evil about that. it is okay. But chances are, if that's all you're getting, you will then just keep doing that forever. And sadly, there is a portion of every healthcare profession, but especially chiropractic, that is predatory in nature. And I know that's a bold claim, but I'm gonna make it because I've seen too many people go for this where an ad in a newspaper pretends like there's 3 spots left or 5 spots left, and they sell some big bold claim about either manipulation, laser traction, some machine that's going to solve all of your problems, and then they sell you a $3,000 to $5,000, sometimes more, package of things that feel good, that leave you just as injured, potentially even more injured at the end of it, and that's wrong. So I'm a firm believer in, even when you see an in-person chiropractor, let's just be real. Like, what's the percentage on if you went once a week, 3 times a week, which is usually the max, right? 3 times a week, we're still talking single digit percentages of what your total week is. So if there's 176 hours in a week and you go there for 3, that means there's 173 hours left. I think there's 176. Somebody's gonna have to fact check me on that one. I'm so bad with math, I have no idea. I'm not even gonna pretend to guess. But in any case, it's this tiny percentage. Like, that's not where the change is gonna happen. The change is gonna happen from what you do as soon as you wake up. The change is gonna happen from what foods you eat that either promote healing or don't. The change is going to happen from hydration, what you're drinking, the vitamins you take, the sleep, your stress management, your movement, your general movement. Are you walking? Are you getting physical activity? Your specific movement, the exercises to that area, the mobility exercises to that area, the strength training, the stability. So if you're at a place where all they're doing is to you, like you're a car and they're a mechanic, it's time to change, because you're not a car. You're a human being. And the system is sadly incentivized to keep you with the right level of injured, is the actual most profitable thing for most practices. So it takes a special kind of clinician that says, I'll take the challenge of finding business success through a model that doesn't keep people broken. And there's definitely a way to do that. It just does take some more creativity. It takes some more tenacity, and it takes having your heart in the right place.
I love that. Basically, what you just described is a lot of the green flags you should look for in clinicians. They should not be one creating urgency, creating this problem, and they magically have the solution for it. And they definitely should be discussing more than just what they're going to do in the office. What are you going to do at home? How are you going to create behavior change? That's when the real change happens. I want to talk a little bit more about the predatory in nature. And I don't want to put your wife under the bus here, but I love her thyroid journey and figuring that out. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what red flags were in that process that you think would be helpful for patients who are looking for a clinician, maybe in a specific niche like a thyroid specifically, that they can look out for?
Yeah, she's happy for me to relay, and she actively is sharing all the time her story because it is a really compelling one. We have a 15-year-old son. He turns 15 in a couple weeks. So 2009, we had him, and shortly after, her health fell apart. We had no idea what was going on. We were both pretty young. We were 24 when we had him, and she had a lot of postpartum depression, a lot of just changes hormonally and emotionally, and then started to show some autoimmune issues. We went to a doctor who basically said, and I'll never forget this, it is all in your head. There is nothing wrong. And that wrecked her. Fast forward a decade, she'd still been battling this. And in the earlier years, when after about a year of suffering, she went back to another doctor, was put on medication. The medication, because Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is the specific kind she has, fluctuates. So you could have like too low of levels, too high of levels in intervals of weeks to months. But they didn't tell her any of that. And they just said, come back in 6 months for more testing. So in 6 months, we'd go back and the levels would always be all over the place. And she'd have different side effects depending on of the medications, depending on whether it was overdosed because of where she swung her levels to or underdosed. And eventually she was like, I got to get off this. This medication is making me honestly a different person. And it took probably 6-7 years for her to get fully off of the medication because she had to self-study. There was not a single resource in the world for her. She's consumed every book on Hashimoto's. She has notebooks full of stuff. She's taken webinars. She really became self-empowered. And I'm really proud to say that as of just this past year, she now has directly in the center of the normal range, normal thyroid hormones, which medical doctors told her would be impossible. That was the word that was given to her, impossible. And it takes a lot of work. She has to protect her sleep. She has to protect her stress. She has to be very specific about what's right for her nutrition. There's no blanket like, oh, gluten-free, soy-free, all this stuff. She did do a lot of those things, but I could tell you from the people that she's also just helped as friends, because she's not in healthcare, she doesn't coach any of this stuff. Sometimes it matters. Gluten matters. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes caffeine matters. Sometimes certain vitamins that are deemed as good when you have an autoimmune issue is actually not good. But she had to figure all of this out on her own. And on the predatory side, there is a very well-known author, there's actually several of them, that put out these book funnels that are targeted to people with autoimmune conditions, where the book is super helpful and then gives a call to action for, let's say, a free consult with their team. And then the team really uses emotional sales tactic to sell a multi-$1,000 plan that's really just like an extension of the book, usually like $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 to just have accountability through to implement what's in the book. And she was really close to buying one of those and said, you know what? I'm going to do this myself. And basically just took the reins, recruited a team. She signed up for a virtual, fully remote type, like rehab-ish type doctor-led exercise routine that was right for her. She did some consults with nutritionists. She basically pieced it all together herself. And sadly, I do think that that's what's required right now is extreme ownership of your own health, because you really can't trust the traditional medical system. And what you should do is recruit your own team, but put yourself as the point person.
And that's such a good point, because I feel like in many clinician-patient relationships, that is not what it feels like. As you mentioned before, it's the clinician, it's the practitioner doing something for you, to you, something of that nature. Whereas what you just described, and your wife taking ownership and really leading the charge in this effort, that's what it should feel like more often. Because as you said, it's at the end of the day, it's our health. We have to take ownership of that. That's such an important thing. And I understand for a lot of people that can be a challenging thing to hear. Whenever you need to take responsibility, you need to step up. It's not something that's easy to hear, but if you've been dealing with a condition for a longer period of time, or you've had doctors tell you that this is impossible and you'll never do this, you'll never do that, your practitioner, your clinician should be there to support you, not so much to tell you what you can't do, given the realm that we are working in. Again, there are definitely conditions where there are instances where you shouldn't be doing things. But I think in the world of musculoskeletal health, a lot of times it's not about what you can't do, but how is their clinician supporting you to tell you what you can do, or showing you how you're able to achieve your goals. And unfortunately, that's not the majority of clinicians. And I think that brings us to another really good point that we should probably discuss here, is that, why is it that we find ourselves in this state where the majority of providers, and again, you use predatory, which is a strong word, but I don't disagree. And I think this is something that we need to call out. Why is it that we feel the majority of providers work in this manner? Is this just a product of the system? Is it a lack of education? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a combination of all of it, but you could trace it back to the roots of how the healthcare system was formed around the pharmaceutical industry, and then as an extension, the insurance industry. So the insurance industry is actually incentivized to keep you at the right level of sickness, because at the right level of sickness, there's lots of profit generated, And I don't know if you know this, but the quarterly, that means in just 3 months, one of the biggest insurers, the bill from United Healthcare, posts a quarterly profit of 50 to 60 billion dollars. Every time I say, even right now, I want to go fact check myself and be like, that has to be wrong. And then you go and check their quarterly earnings, and it's with a freaking B, a billion. That's one company, man. That is one company. So the cumulative profit of these of the health insurance companies, the big ones, is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, consumers are responsible for paying their premiums, their deductibles, their co-insurances, their co-pays, these four levels of bills, and then clinicians are getting under reimbursed, and they're typically put in a position where they have to do one of two things. That is either you commit fraud in order to get paid through overbilling, billing multiple people an hour, or false billing so that the amount reimbursed per session is high, or go to extremely high cost cash sessions. And if you go to these high cost cash sessions, but don't have great sales experience, you will inevitably end up taking an easy route, which is selling to our primitive fears, which is making you feel broken and positioning the clinician and their skill set as the only cure, as the way, as the path forward. And it can be really profitable. So the key is to find clinicians who, in my opinion, lean on technology, because when technology is used, and technology just can mean an app, meaning like if you're a patient, you're listening to this, call and ask people, like, oh, do you use any apps? And if they say no, I'm probably calling somewhere else, because apps to tell you what to do between sessions have been available since like 2013 or so. That's really when they started to become a little bit more polished. By 2015, our practice was using home exercise program apps, not writing stuff down on a piece of paper, not printing out little stick figures of people squatting and saying, like, do this. So there's these apps that are readily available. They cost sometimes $10 a month for the provider. You as the patient don't have to pay anything. So if they don't want to pay $10 to $100 a month to give you a digital version of what to do between sessions, at the bare minimum, I'm going somewhere else. And usually what it means when they use technology is that they're also going to be more affordable than the super high cash rates, because the proper use of technology drives down the cost of things as time goes on. So just think about stupid, easy example, Uber. Think about 10, 20 years ago, to get a private driver was a massive expense that most of us could not afford. And now with a click of a button, for a wildly cheap price, you could have, maybe a questionable Honda Accord pick you up for $12. But if you pay a little bit more, you get the decent one, but it's still exponentially less expensive than a black car a decade ago. That same thing should be and is happening in healthcare, but you just have to do a lot of work to go find them, because we are in the minority. That it is still one in, I don't know. I wish I had a statistic for you, but it's probably 1 in 100. So you have to be prepared to do some legwork, and that's so annoying as a consumer to hear that. But it's like, your body is worth it. You got to do the research. You got to block out some time in your calendar, and not just go to the first Google hit or whatever your insurance recommends or whatever your medical doctor recommends.
Yeah, and speaking on the insurance piece, I think when we talk about not using insurance when it comes to musculoskeletal care, or really any care in general, a lot of people fear, well, how on earth will I be able to afford that? And I know you talk about this a lot, but having a health budget, I think, is something that is so underrated that we don't talk about enough. What suggestions would you have to people who maybe have never even thought about this, haven't put away any money towards their health? Any beginner suggestions for how to get out of this insurance model and maybe make it realize, oh, it's not as expensive as I initially thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the transparent truth is that I didn't know this until I started working with a budgeting coach. So about, I guess it was 3 or 4 years ago, I stumbled upon a guy, Nick True, on YouTube. He's got a ridiculous amount of free trainings and stuff. And one of the things that he promotes is creating budgeting is typically looked at as a negative thing. Like you look back and you say, where did all my money go? And then you're mad at yourself for where it went. And then you do it again next month. And then, it's sort of a surprise where your money went. Where the purpose of budgeting really is to look forward. So I use a tool called YNAB. You need a budget. I have no affiliation with Nick or these apps. These are just the things that I use. There are other tools too, but these are just the ones that I use. And the purpose is to give dollars a job in the future and to make your money the way you make your money choices reflect your values and priorities in life. So a lot of the time we accidentally spend our money in places that really the values are not aligned. Like how much do we spend on eating out or monthly subscriptions to every streaming application or video games, depending on what demographic you're in or whatever. Wherever your money goes, we should be checking it monthly and saying, where is this aligned with my priorities in life? And if you're in pain or if you have some sort of injury or some sort of issue with your health, I think that that's probably really high in your priority list and high in your values list, but likely your budget doesn't account for that. So I believe in starting small. That might be just adding a few $100s a month, or even $50 a month, and starting to build a budget where you have a pool, so that when you come across healthcare uh, assets, whether that be books, courses, professionals, you have the firepower to be like, you know what, this is worth me pulling from our budget. So that has grown to my family. It is, if I were to give you a percentage, it's just under 10% of my monthly income goes to my health and fitness budget for my family. So my wife, myself, my kids don't really need it yet, but my son is getting older. I mean, I'm gonna instill that in him, and he just joined the weightlifting team at school. So I would consider that as like his first dive into that, and that costs money, and we built a home gym, got him stuff. But so 10% of my income goes right into a bucket that's for proactive health and fitness, and that is not my insurance premiums. That is not medical expenses. So medical actually has a different line item that is a little bit more reactive. Like, there's some money there that pools in case we need to go to urgent care and get, antibiotics or some sort of nose spray or whatever. But this is for proactive use of health and fitness. And I really suggest everyone go do that.
I love that. And something my budget coach had me do when I became self employed, because I was losing benefits. And I know a lot of people who become self employed really, really fear that, is write out all the stuff you're paying for right now for your health and then compare it to the doctors that you're seeing. Do they have a cash rate? A lot of doctors right now have a cash rate. It's very, very common. You might be pleasantly surprised that it's less than you were paying when you were paying the copays, deductibles, monthly insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And remember, catastrophic insurance does exist. There are a lot of opportunities to make this accessible for yourself in the time that we're in right now.
And just to add to that point, I think one thing that is highly prevalent within the chiropractic profession is signing up for these indefinite treatment plans. You're seeing them for 6 months, 12 months, 30 visits, 50 visits, and then they re-up you for this indefinitely, potentially for the rest of your life. Because as we've spoken before in this podcast, it's giving you the sense of urgency and need. And if you don't have this service, there will be negative consequences. So when you look at the amount of money that you could potentially spend throughout your life on a service that is probably not providing you much more than temporary relief, all of a sudden these prices that you're going to get with people that are actually working with you and supporting you and using things like technology, like we've mentioned before, to have a connection with you in between visits, the value that you're getting for the amount that you're spending is so much greater that I think you really feel that you are getting your money's worth out of care. And that's what your provider should be giving you. Is at the end of the day, that is money well spent. You walk away from whatever service it is that you're receiving with something other than the need to go back. They should be providing education. They should be providing you support. They should be helping you develop the tools that you need to ultimately take care of yourself and proceed forward with whatever goals it is that you have. And if you don't feel like you're getting that from your musculoskeletal provider or your chiropractor, it might be time to look for somebody else. And to bring it back, just as one of the points that we had before, you made this post, I think, back in February, Frank, and I think this is something that I really wanted to touch on today. And maybe one of the reasons why it's difficult for some providers to have enthusiasm in care and really put forth the energy and effort that each patient deserves. And the post that you made said this: our profession is so broken that the majority of PTs and chiros have given up on the simple pursuit of enjoying their work. So I think when it comes to finding a provider, it's not just all of these services and the technology and the things that they can provide you. I think when you begin to maybe look into these different niches of providers, I would say that most of them truly enjoy and are passionate about what they're doing. What would you add to that?
Sorry, my unmute button didn't work there for a second. Yeah, I do think that when someone is broken out of the system, they enjoy their work, and we do our best work regardless of what profession you're in when we're having fun and we're enjoying ourselves. And that seems to have gotten lost in the grind of the healthcare profession, where, let's just say, working more traditionally in a hospital is really associated with having a pretty terrible day-to-day life. And it's just viewed as who is going to be the sacrificial lamb and live their lives in this kind of toxic work environment, overcrowded rooms, and just kind of suck it up, instead of someone at the top saying, what would it look like if we were to reimagine how a hospital works? And not to my knowledge, there's no one asking that question. So that's a big societal issue where most healthcare providers are trapped in corporate mills, hospital systems, and insurance-based companies that have them trapped. And I do believe that as patients, we often sense that. So my mom was in therapy, physical therapy, more recently, and patients tend to they like us, right? Like it's hard to not like your PT, your chiropractor, your nutritionist, like the allied health services. If you're not an MD or a DO or a nurse practitioner, like, patients like us. Why? Because we got into this for the right reasons. There's very few chiropractors that got into chiropractic that said, I'm going to do this to get rich. I'm going to do this to retire to the Bahamas when I'm 40. So we're not investment bankers or real estate agents. And we need those. I'm sorry if anybody's listening to that. I'm sure you love what you do too. But the purpose here is, like, we got into this so it makes us likable. I think that likability often leads to letting us get away with stuff that we should not be getting away with. So my mom, I remember, this one story where she basically had to remind the assistants who are working with her every day who she was, what she was working on, because the physical therapist would just not physically be able to be with her for more than 10 minutes. And the guy was clearly stressed out and overworked and exhausted, but my mom liked him, right? So if you're a patient and you're sensing that, if you got into one of these bigger corporate mills and you're sensing that, let's say in the chiropractic world, where I see that most is pain clinics, where there's usually like some sort of medical credential who owns the facility, and then they employ a chiropractor, an acupuncturist, a massage therapist, and then you as the patient are just like a cog in a wheel that jumps between these things, seemingly for a real good reason at first, but then you realize it's just to maximize what they're billing. And if your chiropractor is exhausted and looks tired and can barely keep it together, that's where this post relates, where they probably have given up the joys of the job of connecting with another human and freeing them from pain or freeing them from some sort of medical condition to go and live their life. There's not much better feeling than that. And so many of us get that robbed of us by the system that we're in, that we don't even get to experience that anymore.
Yeah. And just to add on that, another kind of red flag that's commonly seen in chiropractors, specifically with this, is if you see a senior doctor or one doctor just for the initial evaluation, just for their review of findings, where they sell you this massive care plan, and then you see a different doctor every single time you go in, that's probably a red flag in your chiropractor. And that's probably not the right place for you.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think our profession is still very much in a place where this is going to be the majority of chiropractic clinics that you walk into. And we're not here to say that all of the chiropractors that are operating in this way are bad people. They're absolutely not. Many of them are very passionate about your health and your well being, and they are there for the right reasons. But to just touch base a little bit on the education that we have to go through to become licensed and to become doctors who are practicing, it is not enough. We don't have enough experience. We don't get enough education. We're not up to date on a lot of the current research to be able to provide care at the highest level. So I think this is why, and another one of the reasons why we continue to see practitioners operate in a certain way, it's just because we don't know. So again, for all of you that are listening to this, we're not here to say that every chiropractor that exists that's operating in this way is a bad person. This is more to be informative that there is more that the profession can offer and that you don't have to settle in your care. And that hopefully by the conversations that we've had today, you know a little bit more about what to look for. So I want to wrap things up here, but I want to give you one more chance here to kind of put in some thoughts, Frank. We've talked about a lot of things today, but if you had to give our listeners one take-home message that would really guide them in the direction of their health, if they're feeling like they're lost, if they're feeling like they're not getting enough out of their providers, what's a good closing message that you would say to them that might point them in the right direction?
So my advice is really simple. We need to block time on our calendars to reflect our priorities. So just like budgeting our money needs to reflect our priorities, budgeting our time needs to reflect our priorities. So if you have found yourself, if you listen to this and you're like, oh man, I think I'm in one of these facilities they're talking about, maybe you just jumped the gun, maybe you went to the closest one, maybe you just took the one referral, is just make time. Pull out your phone right now, go to your calendar app, carve out 1 hour, either on a weeknight or a weekend. And the first step, breaking this into chunks, is just spending time on the internet, listing all of the potential options that you could explore. So oftentimes when patients just start calling the offices, we tend to like jump in a little bit too fast. I'm a big believer in breaking big decisions down to chunks. So the first step is just break out a Google sheet or an Excel sheet or an old-fashioned pen and paper and be like, okay, here's my issue. Here's what I want. Here's what I'm looking for. What are my options locally? Then start going through social media and see what your options are virtually. Yes, reels are funny. Instead of scrolling your reels at night, though, if you follow the right healthcare professionals, you could quite literally download so much education through very helpful snippets of education-based content that industry experts are putting out that'll put you in a position to then be able to choose your provider. So, but the first step is just simply making a list of what are all my options locally, what are all my options digitally, and then another time put another hour out and say, okay, I'm going to start messaging these people digitally. Okay, I'm going to start calling these people locally. And then you're going to start to rank your list and say, okay, what do I have a good feeling about? Or maybe you need maybe an online coach for this and then an in-person clinician for this. And that's how you could start to assemble your own care team. But it starts with really putting time on the calendar side to do the actual research.
Yeah, you don't have to settle. You really don't. And taking the time to invest in yourself. I know this is a cliche thing to say, but really taking the time to invest in yourself and invest in your health, especially if you've been dealing with some of these things for prolonged periods of time, it is well worth it at the end of the day. So we want to take one last chance to thank Frank for being here with us today. And I hope you guys all got a lot of information out of this podcast. We do have a link in our description for any questions or comments. I'm sure there will be a few, maybe some negative based on our conversation today, but we're here for all of it. So any questions, any comments, please feel free to leave them in the link in the description. And until next time, we'll see you guys then.